Redditors who work at cemeteries and graveyards, what strange and scary stuff have you witnessed? My dad purchased a cemetery when I was in middle school, and I worked for him through high school graduation. I did yard work, mowing, weed eating, flower beds, etc. Aside from the occasional shadows seen out of the corner of my eye, seeing people who turned out to not be there, and hearing strange sounds, the cemetery was actually a quite peaceful place. But the strangest is when you have a burial in the crypts. Basically, you dig down about 4 or 5 feet to expose giant cement doors. You pull the cement doors off and drop down into a little room. These rooms can fit 2 coffins, or years and years and years worth of cremated remains. So back in the 50s and 60s, families would buy one crypt and the entire fam would be cremated and put in it. Some just put the cremated remains in it and close her up, but others light candles and leave flowers and souvenirs and pictures and shit. It's fucking creepy opening up one of those bad boys after 50 years and finding melted candles and old pictures of the people inside. Plus when you hop down in there you have a weird realization that you are at the same level and completely surrounded by bodies. How do you just casually mention random shadows and people who weren't really there and then talk about how creepy the melted candles were? Like that's some next level minding your own business. I used to do some odd jobs at the 12th century graveyard in my hometown. 12th century, as in the church and its surrounding graveyard had been in continuous use for at least that long. When you keep burying bodies in the same small patch of ground for that many centuries, eventually the soil has been turned over dozens of times and consists mainly of bone fragments. You can't even plant flowers there without accidentally uncovering some teeth or finger bones or something. It's nothing but fragmented skeletons all the way down under the thin turf. The soil sort of resembles seaside shell sand, except on closer examination all the light-colored bits are bone fragments rather than crushed seashells. Not really scary or unexpected, just a bit eerie until you get used to it. You learn to treat anything recognizable as human remains with respect, and just tuck it away out of sight under the plant or whatever else you were putting there. I was a tombstone caretaker for a cemetery in rural Georgia, summertime job for a 16-year-old, nothing crazy, just cleaning off the grime of the elements on tombstones ect. Now to just put a setting, the cemetery included one building that housed bathrooms for the 5 staff members of this cemetery, a small simple mausoleum, and then other than that, flat earth with tombstones everywhere. The only surroundings were dense forests in the Georgia country. That being said, due to the eerie surroundings, I was always a bit paranoid, plus I watch a lot of scary movies and so on. I know, bad combo. So one night I was doing my rounds, and I had to go into the small mausoleum, had some of the richer families in the areas entombed within, and I had to go in, make sure all was neat and clean. Standards had to be upheld for these uppity folks. So I approached, and right off the bat, something was off. The air was pretty damn cold, during the summer in Georgia. That was odd. There was a light coming from the mausoleum, and as I approached, I heard voices, laughter from a child, a little girl. I thought it was simply younger folks maybe. I haven't seen anyone enter or leave the cemetery, and the laughter sounded young. However, as I got closer, the voices and laughter died, like almost instant. I pause. The light I also noticed had gone out. I call the lone security officer that does a few rounds on the lot, 'cause I'm not gonna go in alone, and he comes. We will call him Officer Friendly. When Officer Friendly arrives, we both go inside. We see one of the doors to the entombed remains of a young girl open. Nothing was disturbed within, but it was open, and a doll lay on the stone beneath it. Me and Officer Friendly do a small sweep. It was only 1 floor and 1 room, so it didn't take long. We close the door to the girl's entombment, and we both leave. As we walk away, we get about 30 feet from the mausoleum, and then all of a sudden, boom, voices and laughter again. I jump, and Officer Friendly looks to me, looking pretty shaken, says to me, "You hear it too?" We look back, and boom, lights back, laughter continuing. We don't go back and just book it. I found out the next morning, the door was open again, this time the doll was on the other side of the mausoleum from where we found it the night before. I resigned the next day, good lol. My great-great-grandfather and his son were foremen at the cemetery in my hometown, of course way before I was ever around. The older of them was said to be sensitive, as in he felt and saw things, and there are stories of people that he buried that came by during nights to tell him that they were cold, which means that there were no flowers/wreaths on the grave, or that their feet were cold, the soil around where the foot of the casket was had leveled. He was also said to be able to see people in what we refer to as Hamforth, skin journey. As in the body shows itself to tell someone that the soul has departed. One particular story about that they still tell around the Sunday dinner table is when a friend of his had been lost at sea. Nobody knew of course until much later, but my 2xg grandfather saw his friend entering the house, drenched in seawater, and noisily walk into the living room and sits himself on an old sailor's chest that was by the door, and just as soon the man disappears. My great-grandfather took over his father's job when he got too old to do it. I can't remember any similar stories about him, but there is a joke about some youngsters that tried to scare him that people have told all over the country, probably an imported joke. There were a few people in town that didn't like the fact that the graveyard workers worked after dark, and there were a group of young men that decided that enough was enough, they were going to scare the gravedigger. So they outfitted themselves with white sheets and went to the graveyard and walked around the graveyard saying all sorts of ghostly sounds like, boo. And they found the gravedigger as he was in the middle of digging a grave by hand, and they stood around the grave for what seemed like hours, shouting and screaming and doing whatever it is that ghosts do. The gravedigger paid them no mind and just continued with his work. The young men then, having given up, started to leave, and as they approached the gate of the graveyard they could hear shouting and protesting behind them, as the gravedigger angrily came running towards them, shouting, "It's one thing that you are up and about walking around here, but don't you think for a second that I will allow you to leave." When I was in college I worked part-time at a Jewish cemetery in reception/office management. The cemetery was closed from Friday afternoon through Saturday evening for Sabbath. We sometimes stayed a bit later in the office on Friday afternoons to get bills out or checks processed. We heard a loud commotion by the cemetery entrance, which was locked and only staff could get in and out. The office manager went to see what was going on and made me come with her. We went down to the gate to find an older woman, probably around 70, dressed to the nines, begging us to let her in. She kept saying she needed to get back. This was in the suburbs of NJ, so you needed a car to get around, but we didn't see a car or anything. She was just there in this beautiful dress. We couldn't open the gate without the cemetery manager, so we went to go get him. We brought him back to the gate and no one was there. We looked at video footage of the entrance and you could see us, the office manager and me, talking, but there was no one on the other side of the gate. The cemetery manager thought we were trying to trick him. I swear to this day we saw a woman in a fancy dress outside that gate. There were multiple cameras and not a single one picked up anyone on the other side of the gate, and you could see the whole gate. All you could see was us. I don't know if it was a ghost or what. The office manager and I decided not to tell anyone else, but we would mention it to each other every once in a while. I worked for a county cemetery department years ago. We would go to all the cemeteries in the county and mow or just do basic upkeep. Occasionally people, mainly farmers, would stumble upon some headstones in a field or a stand of trees, and we would come out and prod the ground with dowel rods to find more headstones and re-establish the cemetery. Soon after I started working there we got a tip about some headstones a farmer found while clearing out a path through some trees for easier access to his field. It turned out to be the oldest cemetery in the county, dating back to the 1700s. After investigating some of the names on the headstones it got really creepy. The story is that before the cemetery was there a schoolhouse stood there. The teachers were a husband and wife. It's not clear on what exactly happened, but the students and the husband and wife all died in the schoolhouse. The information we found kind of made it sound like an illness of some kind, and they were all quarantined in the school until they all died. After that the school was demolished and the students and husband and wife were all buried right where the school stood. So yeah, I'm sure it's haunted. I work at a graveyard, and I just have one thing to say. Plastic. Here in Norway graves are protected by law for 20 years, but after that the spots can be reused. Usually a grave is fine to reopen after 20 years, the body is supposed to be decomposed and pretty much gone. Now back to plastic. Between the 50s and 80s it was common here to be buried in plastic, to minimize smell and leakage. I'm sure they thought it was a good idea back then, but once we started reusing graves in Norway we realized it is a curse. A lot of bodies are wrapped in plastic, and I've myself been part of what was supposed to be a burial at a reused site. The body was about 50 or 60 years old, and should be basically gone, but nope, it was not. The plastic wrap it was covered by kept the body from decomposing, and it's basically just been marinated in its own juices for 50-60 years. The smell was awful, the sight was even worse. I'm sure this is not the kind of story you wanted, but it's honestly the most horrific and bizarre thing I've ever been part of. I don't work in a cemetery, but I did go clean one up with my family. We cut down weeds, planted flowers, so anyways I was wiping off graves when I seen 3 graves side by side and they didn't have the same last name, so I asked my mom if they were related and she said no, but a woman was married to them and they had all gotten into accidents within 2 years of being married to her. She buried them side by side, and when she passed away she requested to be buried in a cemetery 2 counties away. It's strange because the first grave the man died in 1984, the second died in 1986 and the third died in 1988. They were all very wealthy and owned their own businesses, and when they died she closed the businesses. It's not quite the same, but I had an uncle who tried working, as in selling and doing drugs, the graveyards between 10 p.m. and 4 a.m. He only lasted a few nights in that area, then never went back. What was it that scared him so badly that he felt his soul rattle in his bones, as his blood froze cold? Prairie dogs. Fucking prairie dogs. What's so frightening about simple ground squirrels, you might ask? Those cute little fuzzballs that scavenge whatever they can. Well, apparently they like to randomly come out their holes in the middle of the night, and scream. Creepy, but that doesn't sound too bad, right? Well, now imagine being surrounded by dozens of little rodents you can't see, in the pitch black of night, surrounded by the dead, tweaked out of your mind, paranoid as hell, and then suddenly hearing hellish blood-curdling screaming all around you. His little group scattered like roaches, and I think someone fell into a ditch, but he was convinced it was an empty grave. He never did that again. Not really a cemetery experience, but it was still pretty freaky. My grandparents live out in the middle of nowhere pretty much and is surrounded by woods. On their property, there was a whole family that owned my grandparents' property before them. From what I was told, they were killed or something like that. A few years ago, when I was still living with my grandparents, a relative that was related to the dead family came up to the property and wanted to remove the bodies from the land. My grandpa was extremely happy about it because he wanted to expand the house but couldn't because he didn't want to mess with the graves. So they got together and I stood nearby, watching them dig up 4 caskets. There were 3 adult-sized caskets and 1 child-sized casket. And they all looked really old. One of the bigger caskets had holes and cracks all over it. That was the one that my grandpa and the other relative was carrying when the body fell out the bottom of the casket. The body was pretty much bones, but it still had old muscle and tissue on it. I remember feeling sick to my stomach as I watched them uncomfortably put the body back into the casket upside down. As a kid in '82, and Michael Jackson's Thriller was on everyone's minds. One night it was getting late when we got caught in a big rainstorm, so we called it quits on our basketball game and went our separate ways. The big cemetery I cut through must have closed up for the night and I found the gates locked. Going around would take forever, so I decided to climb over the fence, only to land hard on the other side. It was muddy, so I not only wrenched my ankle pretty bad but took a giant mud bath. I was covered in mud, limping, and groaning from pain when I reached the other side. As I emerged from the darkness, a couple saw me limping and groaning, while trying to squeeze through the cemetery's wrought iron fence. I remember their screams to this day. My mom and stepdad were the caretakers of a small cemetery for about 10 years. All of us kids, 6 between the two of them, helped out at one point or another. One summer I was helping my mom with mowing and upkeep. It was a super hot summer, so we would try to go and get the mowing done early before the heat became too unbearable. Well, we had trouble getting the truck going one day, so we ended up starting a little later than usual and were unable to finish up everything that day. My mom had an appointment the next morning, and the day after that it was supposed to rain, so I told her I would go up early the next morning and finish up the trimming with the weed eater. So, it's about 7 in the morning and I am listening to music with my headphones and going around the headstones. Everything was going well until I got to the oldest section of the cemetery. That part was on a small slope of a hill. Once you got to the bottom and looked up, you couldn't see the road, but you could see it again once you were about halfway up. When I finished up the last headstone, I turned off my equipment and started back up the hill. I glanced up in time to see a little girl in a pretty red dress. She was running and disappeared behind a large headstone. I figured her parents were visiting another grave and the little girl ran off to entertain herself. It was around 9 a.m. at this point. I got to the top of the hill and there was no car or people around. The cemetery wasn't really close to any houses, and the girl was too nicely dressed to have walked out there. I looked around and shouted for her to come out. I was able to see the headstone she ran behind, and I would have seen her if she ran out again. I couldn't find her anywhere. I called my mom and told her what was going on and asked if I should call the police and tell them about this little girl. She looked to be about 3 or 4 years old, so she certainly shouldn't be by herself. My mom asked me if she was wearing a red dress. I said yes. Why? So, she proceeds to nonchalantly tell me that was just the ghost girl. Now, everyone who knows me knows that I don't fuck with ghosts. I asked why she didn't tell me there was a ghost in the cemetery. She said she needed my help and was afraid I wouldn't go up if Elle thought it was haunted. Now granted, I probably would have been more leery of the place, but knowing no one else could help her, I would have still helped her that summer, but I would have made sure I wasn't there by myself. I still go there sometimes as I have relatives buried there, but I am always with someone. Fortunately, I never saw any other ghosts and I have never seen the little ghost girl ever again. Former funeral director here. My partner and I had just gotten back to the funeral home from a house call for a 31-year-old woman who died of cancer. As we were moving her body from the cot to embalming table, we heard an audible click and the radio across the room turned on full volume of static. It's one of those old radios you turn the volume dial until it clicks to turn it on. We both looked at each other. He was an extremely religious man and this event visibly shook him, and he left not long after the incident. I shut the radio off as I typically used my phone to listen to music while embalming. When I had finished the procedure and was attempting to move her from the embalming table to a dressing table, I heard that click from that old radio and it turned on full volume yet again. At that point I was fairly freaked out and made my exit not long after. My partner and I never spoke of it again, and nothing like that ever occurred to my knowledge before or after. I am a recreational genealogist. Much of my free time is spent in cemeteries in order to document headstones and mapping the area for records. I was taken by surprise when I was working late and the sun had gone down. I began seeing these lights across the cemetery. The cemetery was in the middle of nowhere, literally surrounded by miles of cornfields. At first I dismissed it as lightning bugs, but soon saw that they were too large and too steady. Shortly after, I started freaking out because I thought that maybe I wasn't alone and it was a flashlight that someone was using and I wasn't alone, at night, walking back to my car in this creepy cemetery. Of course, my panic starts rising and I'm convinced that there is something nefarious at play. I ran to my car, which wasn't easy with all of my equipment. My blinders were on, because I had one goal and I wasn't going to get tripped up by seeing something more worrisome as I tried to get out of there alive. My mind planted everything from demons to grave robbers to other criminals. This was about a decade ago. Solar light bulbs were becoming a popular decoration next to burial sites. With it being a newer type of decoration, I wasn't aware of them. It was 100% a few solar lights. I felt like the biggest asshole, but it was certainly spooky. I take care of a small family mausoleum. The family that is buried there has no living descendants, so it falls to me to clean out the facility and replace the flowers inside the building. I also make sure that there's no damage to the mausoleum. I've become very acquainted with the family that is buried inside. One day, as I was closing up my office, my phone rang and when I answered it there was a very agitated woman on the other end. She was very clearly under the influence of something. She asked me repeatedly if I knew where Jane Smith was. Jane Smith has been buried in the mausoleum since the early 1900s. I asked her why she needed to know. The woman very calmly asked me to go to the mausoleum to double-check that Jane was still there because she believed that she was her. I assured her that I was pretty sure Jane was still peacefully buried and our phone conversation ended a few moments later. Drugs and alcohol are a hell of a thing, but it still creeped me out enough that I don't answer my phone after 5 p.m. any longer and I make sure someone is with me when I go to the cemetery.